All right, welcome to everyone. There are a lot of people sort of in the queue getting added into the webinar, so we're going to wait a couple of minutes, maybe two to 3 minutes, and then we will get started. All right, so just another minute or so. There's still lots of people joining, so I just want to make sure we give everyone a chance to get connected and settled. Refresh and warm your cups of coffee, that sort of thing, and we'll get started in 60 seconds or so. Okay, so I think we'll get started. I'd love to welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name is Anthony Dayton. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer here at Celonis. We have an incredibly interesting, hopefully insightful presentation today. I will be joining you. In addition, the sort of main presenter, the person with the bulk of the insights and content for today is Rob Klopowitz from Forrester. And he'll be speaking to us about why process excellence is really the kind of the key element to world-class operations, especially in this new digital world. And truly, I think there isn't anyone more expert than Rob to share insights, thoughts, and experience from the real world and from theory about how to make that a reality in your business. So with that, I think we'll make this an interactive dialogue. I think Rob and I will spend a little bit of time going back and forth, but let me turn it over to Rob to share with you what he'll cover today.
Thanks, Anthony. And I guess the first thing I'll try to do is to live up to that introduction. So thank you very much for that. And thanks everyone for joining. I think this is actually a really fascinating time to start to have more and more in-depth discussions about process, because there's something very real that's going on out there. This massive spike in interest in process excellence, and I think it feeds into our desire to do more and more process automation. And a lot of it is coming down to this concept of the digital world. So I love this title, which Celonis was nice enough to suggest for this, around process excellence becoming the key to world-class operations, because I think that's really what's beginning to drive this massive uptick in interest, is that as we move to a digitized world, everything becomes increasingly exposed. Your operations, all of the things that are happening manually and inefficiently, and you've been able to withstand the effects of that for many years, are suddenly getting exposed to your employees. They're getting exposed to your customers and patients and citizens right on down the line. And then it seems to be getting pressed a lot around the concept of digital transformation. So I want to talk about three main topics today. One is this process imperative. What is driving this massive uptick in interest in process? The second is the technology challenge and opportunity, because I think a lot of what we're doing now is responding to this interest in process excellence by simply automating everything in sight. And that's not necessarily the answer either. We need insights around how we're doing work today before we can intelligently think about the application of technology. And then we're going to have some recommendations before we close out today. So first off, let's talk about this concept of the process imperative and what we see that's going on here. And I'd like you to take a look at this chart. We do this every couple of years. We're about to put this survey back into the field, but this is really around the tie of process excellence, process automation to digital transformation. And this went directly to process professionals. So these are folks who think about improving processes each day and increasingly are thinking about the automation of those processes. And just look at what's happening in terms of the primary focus of process improvement. 2 years ago, 13% of process improvement was in support of digital business transformation. It doubles to the current period and doubles almost out to 50% if we go out to 2 years from now. So this is very real, and this is remaining consistent each time we do this survey, which we do every 2 years. So why is this so important? It's really important because if we used to think about the drivers of what used to drive process automation, it was always about cost takeout. If I can just reduce cost, if I can reduce errors, then I declare victory. But when you start to transform your operations, all of a sudden you realize how interconnected all of the processes in your organization are. And you could take an awful lot of cost out of an organization. You could take an awful lot of cost out of your processes and not really move very far towards digital transformation. You still have manual wait states, you still have inefficiencies that you've been living with for a long time. And I think this is really what drove this massive uptake in interest that we're seeing now in process mining. So if we look about process mining, in particular process diligence, we've been at this for a long time. If we just think about process mining as one component of process diligence, this is 20-year-old technology. This is something that we've been at for a while, and it's really hovered around this area of discovery. How am I doing processes today? How am I working today? And where can I find inefficiencies? And you find those organizations, those industries, which have focused really specifically on the area of understanding their processes and improving them, and they were able to drive really huge competitive advantage. One could argue that if you look at the excellence of German car manufacturing as an example, it's around understanding every intricacy of their process and being able to do it as effectively and as efficiently as possible. But we're now starting to see this spread. We understand the power of process insights, and we start to see this to spread to things like conformance, really big uptake around understanding my processes to understand, am I compliant? Am I doing something that will drive privacy? Am I doing something that will drive regulatory compliance within my organization? And certainly what we find out upon going into a lot of organizations is that, well, you documented a lot of processes, you actually aren't following those processes the way you should. So, huge insights coming from here. Again, a real traditional strength around process mining. But what we're now finding is this massive shift. So if I'm able to do my processes more effectively, if my operational processes, no matter how far in the background they may seem, are potentially touching a customer experience or patient experience, can I identify those and make those more efficient? I still want to take out costs. I still want to drive efficiency. I still want to drive effectiveness. But can I start to enhance the experience of the employees? Can I start to enhance ultimately the experience of our customers? And this is where we see this huge uptick in interest around process mining. And then the last piece I think that we can actually throw on the table now is this desire for process mining and process excellence to give us guidance. where and how should we place our bets? How should we go about prioritizing those things that we're going to actually look at, either just improving or even potentially automating in an increasingly digital world?
So Rob, let me just chime in here. I think for everyone on this webinar, I mean, this is an incredibly exciting time because, in a way, because we've had this sort of digitized data now available to process experts, it's, in a way, process is becoming the cool new thing. It used to just be about bar charts and line charts and how we can get insights out of data. And now what we're seeing is that a core of making your business better is the underlying business process. And these really used to be very different domains. The domains of process expertise, Six Sigma and Lean and all these sort of process ideas were completely divorced from the domain of the digitized business. And now these worlds are coming together and process is cool again, right? The next 10 years of excitement are going to be driven around business processes, and what a great time to be at the center of that. And then just to highlight this point, there's a shift away from simply understanding your business, understanding your processes, towards making those processes better and driving business outcomes. How do we actually see measurable improvement in the underlying business? And this aligns very tightly with the Celonis product strategy, where we've been investing. So clearly, we have, as you point out, we have great expertise in process mining, that underlying technology for understanding the process. But we've been investing in things like our action engine capability, the machine learning workbench as a core part of the platform, things like task mining for understanding what's happening on the desktop, which are really capabilities about driving and recommending, guiding, to use your words, changes and improvements in the underlying process. So just to highlight it, everyone on this call can be excited to be a process person.
Process is cool again. It was, I often think about it like when mom used to make me eat, kale or Brussels sprouts or something horrible. And it's like, but now we're all discovering the power of superfoods and bacon to add to them. So with that in mind, this becomes a very different task, I think, than what we used to, address around process mining and process analytics. And it becomes part of this kind of different continuum. And I think, if we go back to the Lean, the Six Sigmas, those folks who were always a little bit, maybe held at arm's length in the organization, all of a sudden that role, I think, is morphing. We're really seeing that take on a very different, some very different aspects, and it's becoming really important, and it's really starting to meld with other roles in the organization. And what we're starting to see emerge as we look into where folks are going around process excellence, and particularly as relates to process automation, is this cycle that we're seeing where I'm using tools like process mining to discover how I'm doing things today. And one of the things we'll find is that we're doing it at a higher scale than we ever were before, and a massively higher scale, from small targeted efforts to now trying to improve processes across hundreds of processes within the organization. And the analysis that comes from that becomes very interesting as well. So I now, for the first time, might know how I'm working. This Discover box is really not trivial, right? People do not know how their processes execute today. And interestingly, if you bring 5 people into the room, you'll get 5 different opinions and potentially maybe even some contention going on in the room. But once we have an objective baseline, we can start to analyze that. We can start to now actually document how we're doing it with the business, and not only how we're doing it today, but start to move towards re-engineering. How should we be doing this? Is this a candidate for automation? Does this affect something that is critical to my business? If the guidance from the C-level is that we're going to have more straight-through process in customer onboarding, by way of example, is this ripe for automation to take out manual wait states on the part of the customer, or simply to take those wait states out of an employee experience? And sometimes we're going to automate that, and sometimes we're not. But then what the thing is that's interesting then is we're also then going to go into a repeat cycle. So we don't stop this. The good old days of process improvement, business process area engineering, you stopped. We don't stop anymore. We go right back into the analysis phase. And again, what makes this a different challenge than what we used to have is the scale that we're doing it. We're no longer doing this one massive process and then turning it around like, you know, the classic old BPM project. Those still exist. They're still important, but side by side with those, we're now doing this many, many times with a common goal in mind. So when you're turning speedboats, when you're saying the people in this part of my organization who touch one part of potentially a customer experience are now over here and interacting with another part of the organization, my supply chain is not separate from my logistics, is not separate from my finance systems. These things are all increasingly intertwined in a digital world, and there's hundreds of these things that are floating around out there that require re-engineering. And one of the areas that we try to dive into most deeply at Forrester, and we've been on this research now for the better part of a year, is the overlap and interaction between what's happening in customer experience, customer journeys, and then the underlying processes and where those processes can be made more effective. And what we're looking at here is, you know, is on the top, we're looking at a customer journey map. And these are things that we as process professionals or automation professionals don't necessarily understand. Somebody receives a statement in the email and they're angry and they throw it on their desk. This isn't stuff that we think about. But at some point, what happens is you're looking for a customer service number, you're looking for information that they want in order to log you in, you're looking at areas where the process bogs down and makes things difficult for that customer in this instance. And this area in the yellow below is something that we can look at and say there's fundamental inefficiencies here, and we can automate. We could take that wait state out. We can make that go straight through, and the customer never has to see that friction at all. So what's emerging then is this new interaction model, this new roles and responsibility model between the process professional and the automation folks and the customer service. And this happens across a lot of different journeys within your organization. They look the same, but they're not the same. But there's a great deal of power and a great deal of what the folks that we talk to at Forrester who are trying to tap into to say, how do we support more of a digitized experience for our customers?
So Rob, what I really appreciate is that framework you shared a couple of slides ago. You know, this idea of discover, analyze, document, and then re-engineer and automate. I think that for everyone on the call is an incredibly useful framework to bring back to your organizations, a way to think about this thing. And this idea of BPML as the sort of underlying language of process. Every sort of great new innovation needs a sort of a common language, a way for people to talk about that and to share between. And I think this is I think that's a really nice insight for people. What's also, I think, you know, at the core of the Celonis product is this idea of a business process, and you know, and the BPML representation of that of course feeds into things like conformance checking and seeing whether or not the way you actually work conforms with your stated goals or stated process. But I also want to underscore another point you make here, which is this idea that this is a data-driven process, a bottom-up process driven by what's actually happening in the organization, in your systems, versus a top-down, here's what we think is going on inside it. And I think that's really the kind of the key insight here, which is by looking at the data and then using that to drive what this framework here, it allows it to become agile. It allows it to scale. So you make this point, which I think is exactly right, which is this is happening at a much higher scale than it's ever happened before. Well, that's because it's data-driven. And it also makes it repeatable. You know, if it took you 6 months to do it once, it's going to create a strong incentive to not do it again. If you can do it in minutes because it's driven by the actual data of the organization, that allows it to become repeatable. And then just finally, like this idea of the customer journey, and this is the ultimate example of a full end-to-end process. Your customer doesn't care how you're organized internally. They just want a great experience. And so having that data-driven approach is a fundamentally new way of thinking about it.
Yeah, the other thing about this, Anthony, I think that's really important is This model allows you to make mistakes. It allows you to say, I think this is how it's going to work. But if we kind of think about, like, how did business process reengineering get such a black eye back in the Michael Hammer days? A lot of it was massive upfront planning, and then what it led to was not necessarily an optimized process. And we're thinking about it very differently now, which is that we're going to experiment, we're going to change, we're going to look at that data and all of these processes, the documentation associated with them, and potentially the approach that we've used to automate it are all living. They're all living, hence the repeat cycle, and hence the importance of BPMN as that lingua franca that says each of the pieces of this stack, whether it's the stack that's doing the discovery, the documentation, or potentially the automation, all have a common notation language for what a process looks like. I want to shift gears a little bit now and just talk about the technology, because I think this is really important right now. And the reason I think this is important is because I think we're increasingly throwing technology at the problem, right? So I have an automation problem. My competitor is fundamentally more automated than I am. I'm competing with Amazon, or I'm competing with, with some other digitally transformed, digitally native company. And I think we all don't have to dive too deeply into how threatening that can be. But the response on the part of IT, if we just let IT work on it, is to say, well, if I just deploy enough bots, enough RPA bots, I'll be fine, right? If I just build enough software, I'll be fine, and I can build it faster. And all of these things are potentially pieces of the solution that you'll bring together. There'll be digital process automation. We'll have content flowing through these systems. We'll build things faster with low code. We'll build things that we couldn't automate before through robotic process automation. And AI will increasingly give us ability to do things faster and more effectively. But what we implore you at this point to do is to say, stop here, think about your outcomes, think about your processes, and then apply technology where and when it's appropriate. And more importantly, what we'll get to in just a moment is the right technology, because a lot of the insights that you're going to get from these tools and from the analysis that the tools provide will give you a great deal of guidance as to, if you automate, what is the right technology for that automation.
So I think it's a really important point. I think, fundamentally, Celonis is a software company. We are sort of primed to think of the world as needing a technology solution. We'll figure out the problem later. But I think you're exactly right. That's exactly wrong. And I think your point about Amazon is important, because I think intuitively people think of Amazon as a technology company, or maybe it's a retailer, sort of an end customer engagement company. And there's an absolutely fascinating article in the New Yorker a few months ago, and in it they say, they're obviously talking about what makes Amazon so dominant, and the article makes the point that at its core, Amazon is not a technology company, it's a process company. What makes them so valuable is their underlying business processes. And I think, in a way, they're setting the frame for what every business needs to do to compete in the next decade. And just very quickly, this idea of outcomes, the focus on outcomes first, will be a major focus for Celonis this year. We have Celosphere coming up at the end of May, our global partner, user, and customer conference. It will be in Munich. This will be, in a way, the central theme of that event. I think, Rob, you're planning on being there as well. So, but anyway, so Celosphere, this idea of outcomes first, focus on business outcomes, will be the major theme of that event.
And I think that's exactly where, far be it for me to correct the CMO, but I think it's the end of April, not the end of May. But
You're absolutely right. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a process for figuring this out. But you're spot on. And I want to go back to that first slide that we had, Anthony, which was the one that said that we're focusing on digital transformation. Those digital transformation, business transformations, are coming from the C-level, and they're outcome driven, right? They are. I want to have X percentage of my experiences on the part of the employees working on this to happen in this manner. I don't want people doing this manual work. I want this level of new customer onboarding happening straight through on a mobile device. That's the business outcome. What lives below that are potentially hundreds of processes that you're stumbling around today. And your observation about Amazon is spot on. They are a process company that moves from process improvement to a really well understood and governed technology model to go about automating those processes where appropriate. I want to point to two other aspects of how we're thinking about this from an organizational perspective. I don't want to dive too deeply into the technology, but I think increasingly what we're getting is really good insights from systems like Celonis, process mining analysis systems that say, this is where the problem lies. You have a long-term orchestration problem. That, in Forrester terminology, is around digital process automation. There's multiple technologies and humans that are going to continue to actually participate in the process. That lives in the area of digital process automation, what we would have formerly called BPM. But below that, you've got ad hoc processes. We can actually start to get more insight into where and how things are happening in an ad hoc, non-structured way. One of the things I think that's really insightful, and where we're seeing some big investments on the part of vendors, including Celonis, is understanding what's happening on the desktop, what's happening in that world of clicks, which is really akin to RPA. And then there's other technologies that come to bear as well. But I think the piece that we really want to focus on here is to say insight into how your processes are running gives you insight into when and how you should use automation, and your automation landscape is really rich right now, so rich as to potentially be quite confusing. The other thing I think we want to focus on, and this has been side by side with that customer research that we've been doing, is just the new role of how process people work within the organization. So if we look at ourselves over there on the right side, the process pro, increasingly we're working very tightly with the business experts to iteratively define and refine processes. We still live in a world of governance, risk, and compliance. Increasingly, we're being asked to work with this fellow in the lower left, the customer experience professional, and probably to actually plug in below that customer service, customer experience professional, not to automatically automate things or re-engineer processes without understanding the implications of what happens to the customers. We're seeing all these initiatives go up in terms of who the sponsors are, and increasingly the sponsors are coming from the executive level. Those business outcomes that we're trying to drive, those are being set by the C-suite, not in isolation any longer. There's a big change management component to this that I think we underestimate. We are all going to become process professionals. When I look at the folks who are doing this extremely well, the patterns that come out over and over again is that the organization is beginning to understand the importance of process, usually with help from process professionals who are centralized and federated out to the business. But everybody is beginning to think in this process improvement mindset and potentially automation. And then, of course, we have technology. But how these folks work together, I don't think we fully understand that. We're trying to establish the best practices. But one of the things that's really emerging very clearly is this process pro, this person that understands how to look at processes, understand more importantly, how to work with the business on improving those processes and potentially automating. This is becoming a really, really important skill set. So for the Lean Six Sigmas on the phone, your day is back. You are the stars of the show again, and you will play an incredibly important and critical role in driving this forward. So this foundation, this concept of how we work together, we have process alignment. We have to understand our current processes. And one of the really huge values that we've gotten out of process mining is objectivity. Certainly scale, certainly accuracy, but also objectivity. The data doesn't lie. The data will tell you how you're working today. And then we have to think about collaborating across a very wide number of stakeholders on that previous slide on how we think about process engineering and automate, and when appropriate, right? I will constantly fall back into the trap of jumping to automation and constantly be corrected by my customer experience colleagues at Forrester. Automation where appropriate, but let's not fool ourselves. If Amazon's your boogeyman, they're very highly automated. And it is, in fact, their key to success, I believe. You should always think about prioritizing these things with strategic objectives in mind. Again, the C-suite is setting our directions. They're giving us the guidance on the business outcomes, and we're executing with a great deal of freedom below that to understand our processes and make them better. And then if it's a customer experience initiative, and that I keep harping on this for a couple reasons. One, it is the center of how Forrester sees the world, is that ultimately your customers, your citizens that you're serving, your patients, if you're in healthcare, they will drive your direction, and you need to be ready to be driven by them. And if this is the case, then you have to think about a different type of working relationship between customer experience and process. And I think what we're really seeing is some great evidence in the research that says these roles are not coming together, but they are starting to work together in more interesting ways, and in more ways where they're supporting one another, and around tools like Celonis that give them some objective truth. So we're starting to see some commonality around the tools as well. And then lastly, like everything else, we're repeating this, right? We're not putting things in place and then moving on to the next project. We're now in this agile world where we're constantly improving processes and constantly looking for opportunities to do things better and more efficiently.
Rob, I think your point about everyone is becoming a process person is really important. And at its core, what that means is there's a massive amount of organizational change being demanded. And that's really about creating a kind of process-ready organization. This is also, if we think about sort of Celonis company strategy for the next few years, that is something we're very heavily focused on. It's how we build not just software implementation services, but really the change management capability to help organizations understand how to become process-driven. And I would also say that it's an area where we built strong partnerships across with big SIs, et cetera, so that they can help deliver that organizational change management capability inside the organization. It's not just about buying a piece of software and implementing it. It's about rethinking the way you run the business and putting process at the center of that. And I think everyone on this call is sort of uniquely positioned to be a part of that new challenge.
Yeah, and I think it's really, and I think I'm glad you pointed out the SI piece of this, Anthony, because I think that's really important. So I can sit and look at what Celonis looked like 3-4 years ago and say, well, this is a niche tool used by a process professional. And then I look at the investment that you and the other folks in the market have done, and I look at it and I say, no, I understand that. As a business user, I can look at that. I can look at that output. I can drill into that output, and I can identify where and how processes can be changed, where there's friction points, where there's improvement. So, great work being done on the part of the software vendors to make the software experience more accessible, but that change management component, it's like, I don't really care how pretty it is. This isn't my job. I work in finance. That mindset shift, I think, is going to be akin to what we experienced with the PCs. For those of us who are old, none of us envisioned that we'd all become spreadsheet jockeys. None of us envisioned that we'd all become designers with tools like PowerPoint, but that has become part of our jobs, in the same way that I think process improvement and thinking about how my piece of this process can be done more effectively will become an ongoing part of our jobs. So with that in mind, just a few recommendations in terms of where to go and how to think about this. We really think that you have to actually start to centralize your strategy for process improvement. There are technology skills and there are process skills that in the best practice environments we're finding are leveraged out to the organization. They're centralized because they're very specific skills, but they have to be federated out to the organization. There has to be this working relationship between these centralized skills, people who think about process improvement, and how they can go out and drive that change into the business. And then, as we think about automate, we're automating for outcomes. We have to understand how we're working before we make that decision to automate. We have to have diligence around process discovery, process analysis, potentially the collaboration for improving the process, and certainly before we jump into an automation solution. And process analytics are among those guides that you can use to say, is this ripe for automation? And then next, there's this concept of the new class of developers. These are everybody else in your organization who is now thinking about process improvement, learning from those process professionals, learning to use the tools on a daily basis that help them think about where and how process can be improved and potentially automated. Because the other side of this coin is the cost and complexity of automation is dropping dramatically. Whether it's RPA, whether it's low code, whether it's new classes of digital process automation, there were things that we used to do in a spreadsheet, which we now, if we identify it and say, this needs to be online, is something that we can say, if that's the outcome of the process insight, then we can actually start to think about automating more effectively, and everybody's participating in that as well. And then lastly, I'll leave you with this. I've mentioned centralization a couple of times. I've mentioned having these key centralized assets. We really think that centralizing a technology governance model is important, that standardization and architecture are what you need to drive this at scale. Whether we're talking about process mining, process discovery, process analytics, process documentation, or moving into the tools that we use for automation, a centralized approach allows us to do this in a standardized way where everybody in the organization has a common language. I look at this tool, I understand the output, and I'm able to do something with that. And I know we don't always like conversations about centralization, but I think that's what you're going to be hearing a lot from Forrester over the course of the next year or so. So with that, thank you. I want to pass it back to Anthony.
Yeah, so I think we'll open it up to some questions from the audience. And so the first one, Rob, actually I think is for you. So someone had asked, I'm going to sort of slightly interpret the question here, that senior executives often look to automation as kind of an easy thing it's obviously easy to measure and it gets them excited. But you're making this point about sort of a broader approach to process excellence. What advice could you give to people on the call about how to get senior executives to sort of think more broadly about process challenges?
So I think there's a couple of hot points that we're seeing emerging on that topic in particular. And one is one that Anthony, both of us have probably said this 20 times during the course of this webinar, is to focus on outcomes. And if you think about outcomes, then suddenly very quickly you understand you don't have an automation problem. So we have focused on cost reduction, for example, as opposed to outcomes for a very, very long time. And one of the things that we can look at in terms of process automation is we've taken huge amounts of cost out. Organizations are becoming very highly automated. If we think of traditional financial services companies, we think about traditional insurance companies or customer service settings. Sometimes they're really highly automated, but sometimes the experience that you or I have is exactly the same. And the reason it's exactly the same is because we're optimizing within silos. And if you optimize within silos, you can take out a lot of cost and not fundamentally change the customer experience, for example. It still takes me 5 days to get a credit card, but I can get an Apple Card in 3 minutes from my phone with a prompt from Apple. So that's fundamentally different. If the outcome then becomes, I have to have an experience which is fully automated and executes in a mobile session, all of a sudden, all of the processes that live below that become exposed in a digitized world. So this is where we compel you to please, have a outcome first mindset. And unfortunately, for better or for worse, if you're going to have an outcome based approach, that has to come down from the C-level. That has to permeate all of your organization. So, all I can say is we've seen this shift in mindset. And maybe what captures it most is this. We used to have the chief digital officer. You'd hire him or her. You'd stick them over here. They were not part of your business. They were not part of IT. They did not have any authority at all over any operational processes within your organization. And then 6 months later, you fired them because you still were not able to compete with a digitized competitor. And the reason is that has to come from the top down. And that person that's driving it, or those people that are driving it, have to have a common vision and authority.
Great point. So we're getting a lot of questions in, which is fantastic. So keep dropping them in. If we don't get to your question, we'll follow up on email, depending on how much time we have to go through these. So someone's asked a little bit more of a product and technical question, which I'll do my best to address. So how might process mining match with a deployed process execution engine, and how would you look at process mining working with those other kinds of technology solutions? And I think this is a great question. It goes back to that framework you shared really at the top of this presentation, Rob, around the movement away from discovering conformance towards enhancement and guidance. What we see Celonis doing with capabilities like Action Engine and machine learning is being able to direct action. And if you think about what it means to direct action, to actually tell people, what actions to take in their business, the machine learning capability is critical because you need to make a prediction about what's going to happen so that you can then intervene in that process and direct a different activity. If you do the same things, you should expect the same outcomes. What you want is people to do different things. And then there's the actual taking of action. And the questioner in their question highlights this because these process execution engines can become ways of actually executing the process. But what you want to make sure is that you're executing the right variation in that process, the optimized one that's going to create the good outcome, the one that the customer wants or the internal employee wants or the vendor wants, et cetera. And so being able to direct the correct intervention, the correct action is really the key piece there. So someone else asked, and this is a great question for you, Rob, how do you get the business excited about process reengineering? Previously, it was tedious, time-consuming, and owners thought they were about to lose their jobs. I can't think of a better way of saying it. So, Rob, how do we get people excited about previously tedious activities?
Well, okay. So first off, there's a couple of things that that come out of these new approaches that we're seeing. And thing number one is it's less tedious, right? So if you just think about what things like process mining and documentation and collaborative documentation tools bring to the table, the first thing they bring to the table is the ability to actually start with an objective view of how things are working today. So why was it tedious previously? Because it was all done manually. If you think about, those of us with a lot of gray hair, when we used to go into these process engineering exercises, 20 years ago, there was butcher block paper on the wall and there were Post-its, and you flew everybody in at tremendous expense. And then you didn't agree on how your business ran. So not only was it tedious, it became, ironically, emotional, right? We became emotional about process. And so there was a few things that were going on. One is we did not have a common base of information. We could not do it at scale. We could not actually look at multiple parts of the business at the same time because we couldn't bring all of the people into the room. Nothing about the manual discovery process was effective. Nothing about it was fun. It was the perfect opportunity for everybody to walk away and roll their eyes and say, well, that was a waste of time. Let's see what those process gurus come up with next. Now, with new tools and new objective baselines and the ability to do it much more quickly, at scale, iteratively, we understand the role of the business, and the role of the business becomes ongoing. Now, I don't want to trivialize that piece of it. Getting people on board and saying this is going to become a part of how you work every day is going to be really, really difficult. It's going to require a lot of change management, but we did turn everybody into an Excel jockey, so it's not like we don't have precedent for this, but it is around a change management strategy that says we have the tools to do it at scale, we have the tools to do it objectively, you don't have to fly to a common place to do it, and it's something that you could be thinking about in terms of making the business better on a daily basis. That's really different. I think it's going to be a big challenge from a change perspective, but I think we finally have the technology in place that actually makes it feasible. So that's thing number one. Thing number two, are people going to lose their jobs? You know, I'm sorry, but process efficiency and automation has always had secondary outcomes. So one of the things we would love to get ahead of this time that we've never been particularly good at is understanding where and how these potential automations could affect the present workforce, and where and how we have to retrain and rethink and redeploy those people into newer, higher value jobs. And hopefully we do that better than we did it, at certain instances in the past. But yeah, it's a big change. But we started with the term the process imperative. It is a necessary change. If you don't make this change, the world is just littered at this point with companies that have either failed or are in the process of failing, faced with highly effective, process efficient, highly digitized competition.
So I will tell you that we're getting a tremendous number of incredibly great questions. So I'm trying my best to sort of pick and choose ones which I think are most interesting. But I really do appreciate everyone typing them in. And again, we will follow up. A couple of people have asked, will they get a copy of the slides and of the recording? And the shortest, that's the easy answer, because the answer is yes. It'll be on our webpage, and you'll get an email follow-up as well. So you can also share the recording with others in your organization, et cetera. Somebody asked for enterprise deployments of process mining technology, where you're really cutting across departments. The questioner used the term cutting across the seams, which I thought was a nice way of framing it. What challenges and mitigating actions have you seen to scaling the use of this technology? I'll quickly chime in here, and then Rob, maybe you can add some thoughts. But one thing I would say, and it sounds counterintuitive, but is to not start with an enterprise-wide deployment of the technology. It's to start with a known high-value process area which is strategically aligned with your company's goals, and focus your first energies around seeing measurable improvement in that process. And it's sort of building from that success that we see true enterprise scale deployments of this technology. I mean, there are customers of Celonis's which are using this truly enterprise-wide, and a great example of that, which we often talk about, is Siemens. They spoke at a recent event series we did called the Superfluid World Tour. And that is a really massive deployment, and they really sort of built their company's strategy around process excellence. But they didn't start there, right? They started by picking out one or two things that they could go and have an impact. So it's really about building to it. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, Rob.
And I think the way that manifests itself, Anthony, is you start to see these smaller pilots that then become routinized for scale, right? So if I think about Siemens, if I think about any one of a number of examples that we've been interviewing over the course of the last year, to think about how they thought about process governance in the organization, you do it a couple of times, you get good at it, you understand the process, you understand how to drive the change, how the process professionals are going to interact with the business people who understand the nuts and bolts of the business. And then we're starting to see this model that says, we scale it by having, really good centralized skills that then get loaned out. And once you understand how to do it well, the other piece is you get this viral demand pull, right? So, wow, what you did over there in the finance department, I need you to come over and do that for me in supply chain.
Yes.
So you start to get some pull as well, which is always good.
Yeah, 100%. And we definitely see that. All right, last question, which I think is a fun one. Somebody asked, how do you quickly explain the value of process mining to non-technical leaders? And the questioner says, my experience is that some people see it immediately, others do not. I think it's a great question. The way I often will quickly explain this to non-technical people is that to be fair, I would refer to it as Celonis, not as necessarily as process mining, but what I would say is that Celonis helps organizations work better. It helps them do the work that they need to do, the thing that they're set up in the world to do, and to do that in a better way, to do it better each day. So each day they're improving. But I don't know, Rob, if you have what do you use to quickly explain it to non-technical?
I usually go more of a little bit more of a technical direction, and to kind of try to tie it back to this idea that your data doesn't have an agenda and your data doesn't have a worldview. So if you really want to find out how your business is running, and you can look into things like your system logs, your event logs, the clicks that are happening on your desktops, you will get an objective view, and that objective view will be really ugly in a lot of instances. It might not be something you want to see, but it will be the truth. So, you know, I just keep coming back to, you know, data doesn't lie. Data isn't trying to protect its job or its headcount or its, you know, or try to skew the upcoming, you know, performance reviews. Or anything that you're going to get with people who have, you know, where you have lots of different opinions and lack of data-driven insight. So, you know, I keep coming back to, if you really want an objective view of how your business is run, and you do, this is where you're going. This is where you're going to have to go as a starting point and a continuing analysis perspective.
So I think that's a great place to end. I know there are a handful of, well, not more than a handful, but a bunch of questions that are outstanding. We will reply to those on email. And let me say, Rob, thank you as always. I think you more than lived up to the introduction. It was fantastic, and it's a really, really thoughtful and insightful presentation. As I indicated earlier, the recording will be made available to you on email, as are the slides. You can share it with others in your organization or friends and family. And I will end by saying thank you for taking your time and joining us today. And we'll look forward to further conversations or other webinars that we do in the future. So thank you.
Thanks.